I think my first reaction wasn't perhaps, there was no sort of ecstatic sort of feeling at all as far as I was concerned. There was certainly a deep and quiet satisfaction. But I also, I know, had a feeling of almost surprise. It was really surprised that, well, here was old Ed Hillary on top of Everest. You know, it was almost hard to believe. The fact that so many people had tried before, and some very good people had been too, and that finally here there was me, actually standing on top of the mountain. I can remember this feeling of slight astonishment, actually.
Sir Edmund Hillary remembers the moment at 11:30 on the morning of Friday, May the 29th, 1953, when he and his climbing companion, Tenzing, became the first men to stand on the summit of the highest mountain in the world.
Men had been dreaming of the climb for more than 60 years. They had been attempting it for more than 30. There had been 10 expeditions before 1953. In the course of them, 15 men, mountaineers and porters, had been killed.
The timing of the triumph could not have been happier. The news reached London on the night before the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen was told late that night. The people of Britain heard it through the radio news bulletins on coronation morning.
It seemed a joyful augury for the new reign. For although Mount Everest straddles the borders of Tibet and Nepal, it had long been regarded as a British mountain, a challenge that British mountaineers should meet and overcome. And although in fact Edmund Hillary was a New Zealander and Tenzing was a Sherpa, a man that is from the high valley villages of the Everest foothills, this was a British expedition and a British achievement.
It had been known for 100 years that the top of Mount Everest was the highest point on Earth. The discovery was made by officers of the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India. Looking northwards from the Indian frontier to the mountain chain of the Himalayas, they'd picked out the main peaks and given them numbers and taken many readings to find out their heights. In 1852, a surveyor working on the figures realized that what they had called Peak 15 until then was the highest mountain in the world. They calculated its height at 29,002 feet above sea level.
They named the mountain after the man who had launched the survey, Sir George Everest. It was later discovered that the Tibetan people had a far more beautiful name for it, Chomolungma, which means Goddess Mother of the World.
The Himalayas form much the biggest mountain chain in the world. The range, 100 to 150 miles wide, stretches 1,500 miles from Afghanistan in the west through Pakistan and India, Nepal and Tibet to Sikkim, Bhutan and Assam at the eastern end. It includes thousands of great mountains and 14 giants that stand more than 26,000 feet above sea level. In this company, Mount Everest, more than 5 miles high, is a supergiant. Its exact height, originally calculated at 29,002 feet, is now usually given as 29,028 feet. It's slightly variable, partly because heavy snowfalls will add a few feet, then strong winds blow them away again, but chiefly because, the geologists say, the mountain is still, very slowly, getting higher.
In geological terms, the rock of the Himalayas is young. The range was formed only 50 million years ago, when the great landmass of India collided with the even greater landmass of Asia. As they crunched together with measureless power, the rock at the meeting place was forced upwards. There was a further upheaval only 1 million years ago, and the mountains that had been made rose even higher. In a sense, the Himalayas are so high because they are so young. There's been little time for erosion, the wearing of wind and ice to grind them down. They're still rising slightly faster than they're being worn down.
When you think about the size of the Earth, nearly 25,000 miles round at the equator, then even the highest mountain does not seem very high. On level ground, a distance of 5 miles is next to nothing. The family car can do it in about 5 minutes. An athlete can do it in half an hour. Seen from a distance, from the moon for example, the Earth looks like a smooth ball. The mountain ranges don't even show up as wrinkles. But on the Earth, 5 miles in vertical height makes enormous differences in many ways.
The word Himalaya, a Sanskrit word, means abode of snow. From 15,000 feet upwards, This is a world of perpetual snow and ice, subject to sudden storms and open to winds of terrifying force. The temperature varies enormously, from burning heat under the midday sun to intense cold at night. The glare of sunlight bouncing off the ice can blind a man temporarily. The cold can freeze the blood in his veins, and when this happens, frostbite, the flesh, usually on toes or fingers, begins to die. At these great altitudes, the air is thinner. There's less oxygen in it. Men get headaches and nausea and find they're panting and gasping a lot. To some extent, their bodies can get used to it. The blood thickens. The heartbeat speeds up. It's called acclimatization.
But the human body cannot adjust completely. Dr. Raymond Green, a Harley Street specialist who was on Everest in 1933, describes the effects of altitude on man, both physical and psychological.
At the top of Everest, you've only got about 1/3 of the amount of oxygen that you have down here at sea level. And every step is an enormous effort. One does acclimatize to a certain extent, and if one confines oneself to climbing at about 1,000 feet a day on an average, one can climb to immense heights, but the climbing is not easy. You take 2 steps and then stop for a breath, and then another 2 steps and stop for a breath. If you bend down to do up a bootlace, you're out of breath for several minutes. Even turning over in bed in your tent is an enormous effort. The temperature, of course, is fantastically low. I can't remember offhand how low the temperature fell, but it was sufficiently low to make one think twice before going out of one's tent for the purposes of nature in the middle of the night.
The high places of the world are hostile to life. Nothing lives there. No plant, no bird, no mammal. Men can get there, but they cannot stay long, not more than a few days. It took them a long time to realize just how hard it was to climb at very high altitudes.
The sport of mountaineering was born in the 1850s and 1860s in the European Alps. When all the main summits had been gained, the mountaineers looked further afield to higher mountains, in the Caucasus, the Rockies of North America, and the Himalayas.
There were British expeditions to the Himalayas in the 1890s. In 1907, a high peak, Trishul, 23,000 feet, was climbed. This was in the Indian Himalayas, that part of the range which lay within the boundaries of the British Empire. Mount Everest did not. Its northern and eastern sides were in Tibet. Its southern and western sides were in Nepal, and neither country welcomed foreign visitors.
But in 1913, a British Army captain called J.B. Noel made a secret journey into Tibet in disguise and got to within 40 miles of Everest. In 1919, after the First World War, he gave a talk to the Royal Geographical Society in London. Now that the poles have been reached, he said, it is generally felt that the next and equally important task is the exploration and mapping of Mount Everest.
And now, at last, an attempt became possible. The ruler of Tibet, the Dalai Lama, was friendly towards the British. He gave permission for an expedition in 1921. The party included scientists and geographers as well as mountaineers. Among the mountaineers was a teacher called George Mallory.
George Mallory was 35 years old, a married man with 3 young children. He was thoughtful and cultured, a lover of music and poetry, gentle in manner, but already widely respected for his skill and courage as a climber. He learnt to climb on the rock cliffs of North Wales. He became an expert on the snow and ice of the alpine ridges. When the chance came of going to Everest, he could not refuse it.
The expedition he joined was a large one. 9 Britons and an army of porters and pack animals to carry their loads, tents and sleeping bags, food and climbing gear 300 miles from Darjeeling in northern India to the Rongbuk Glacier, the great slow-flowing river of ice on the northern side of Everest. It was a marvelous march, through tropical forest at first, then across the high, bare plateau of Tibet, then over even higher passes to find an approach to Everest. It took them more than 4 weeks, and slowly they began to realize something of the scale of their undertaking. In a letter to his wife, Mallory described their first view of their objective.
Suddenly, our eyes caught a glint of snow through the clouds. Gradually, very gradually, in the course of 2 hours or so, visions of great mountainsides and glaciers and ridges, now here, now there, forms invisible for the most part to the naked eye, or indistinguishable from the clouds themselves, appeared through the floating rifts and had meaning for us. One whole clear meaning pieced from these fragments. For we had seen a whole mountain range, little by little, the lesser to the greater, until, incredibly higher in the sky than imagination had ventured to dream, the top of Everest itself appeared.
A week or so later, from the foot of the Rongbuk Glacier, Mallory looked southwards and saw the mountain from closer to.
At the end of the valley and above the glacier, Everest rises not so much a peak as a prodigious mountain mass. There is no complication for the eye. The highest of the world's great mountains, it seems, has to make but a single gesture of magnificence to be lord of all, vast in unchallenged and isolated supremacy.
The aim of this expedition was reconnaissance, finding out about the area, the best way to approach Everest, what the weather was like, how men could stand up to high altitudes. They learnt a good deal. Mallory explored the northern approaches to Everest, climbed a high pass, and looked down on a wide valley to the west of the summit, which he named the Western Coombe, in tribute to the Welsh hills which he loved. Coombe is the Welsh name for valley. The place was to become important in the story of Everest 30 years later.
They explored the mountain's eastern approaches. They decided that the best chance of climbing it was by the North Ridge, and found the best way onto it. This was the route that every subsequent expedition from the Tibetan side was to follow. But when they gained the North Ridge at a place called the North Col, 23,000 feet above sea level, they found themselves cruelly exposed to the prevailing northwesterly gales. They'd been on the mountain for nearly 3 months, contending for much of that time with the stormy weather of this midsummer monsoon. It was time to go home.
The next year, 1922, another expedition set off, with hopes for the summit. They knew that there was a possible route and where it lay. They timed the journey so that they would be on the mountain in the spring weather, before the arrival of the monsoon storms in June. They took cylinders of oxygen. At first, all went well. George Mallory and a young doctor called Howard Somerville forced a route up the steep snow slopes to the North Col, pegging ropes to the ice, fixed ropes over the steeper places, so that the Sherpa porters who followed them would find it both easier and safer. On the North Col, the wind was not too bad, and by mid-May, the camp was well stocked.
They had lots of food, plenty of tea and sugar. It's important to drink a lot at altitude to replace the moisture lost through sweating. Biscuits and chocolate, butter and jam and cheese, tins of soup and ham, even some tins of luxury foods like crystallized ginger and quails in truffles.
What did the early Everest men wear? Howard Somerville described his clothes in detail.
I had a woolen vest, a flannel shirt and 3 cardigans. Not pullovers, but cardigans with buttons so that you can take them off easily. And then a short mackintosh coat with buttons up to the top. On my legs I had long woolen underpants and some sort of loose riding breeches. My boots were very light, but big enough to take 4 pairs of socks. With 4 pairs of socks, the sweat from your feet settles on the outside pair, so that the inner pair stays dry. And as long as that stays dry, you won't get frostbite.
They'd hoped to set up their top camp at about 26,000 feet, but the weather turned against them, and they were forced to camp 1,000 feet lower down. Even so, it was higher than men had ever camped before. 4 of them slept there, and the next day 3 of them, the other man felt too ill, climbed to a height of 26,700 feet on the North Ridge. Then they had to descend in time to get their sick companion down to a lower camp.
They were all tired by now. George Mallory led the way carefully. They were all tied together. Suddenly he heard a confused noise behind him. He drove the pick of his ice axe deep into the snow, hitched the rope quickly round it, and threw his whole weight onto it. He was just in time. One of the men above him had slipped, pulling the other 2 from their precarious footholds. They were sliding out of control towards the glacier, 3,000 feet below. But Mallory's rope held them, and miraculously no one was hurt.
A second attempt on the summit was beaten back by fierce winds and bitter cold, though 2 climbers got to within half a mile of the top. Mallory's view of Everest was changing now. He wrote to a friend,
"It's an infernal mountain, cold and treacherous. Frankly, the game is not good enough. The risks of getting caught are too great. The margin of strength when men are at great heights is too small. Perhaps it's mere folly to go up again. But how can I be out of the hunt?"
He did go up again for the final attempt of 1922. It was June the 7th. The monsoon storms were almost upon them, and there had already been some heavy snowfalls. 3 climbers, with 14 porters in support, set off up the steep slope to the North Col in 4 roped parties. The climbers were in the lead, Mallory among them.
I was following up in the steps, last on our rope of 4, when at 1:50 I heard a noise not unlike an explosion of untamped gunpowder. I'd never before been near an avalanche of snow, but I knew the meaning of that noise as though I were accustomed to hear it every day. In a moment I observed the snow's surface broken only a few yards away to the right, and instinctively moved in that direction. And then I was moving downward. Somehow I managed to turn out from the slope so as to avoid being pushed headlong and backwards down it. For the briefest moment my chances seemed good, as I went quietly sliding down with the snow. Then the rope at my waist tightened and held me back. A wave of snow came over me. I supposed that the matter was settled. However, I thrust out my arms to keep them above the snow and at the same time tried to raise my back, with the result that, when after a few seconds the motion stopped, I felt little pressure from the snow and found myself on the surface.
The climbers were all safe, but what of the porters? They could see one group of 4. They were pointing below them.
It became only too plain as we hurried down that the men we saw were standing only a little way above a formidable drop. The others had been carried over. We found the ice cliff to be from 40 to 60 feet high. The crevasse below it was filled up with the avalanche snow, and there were signs enough to show us that the 2 missing parties of 4 and 5 were buried under it. From the first we entertained little hope of saving them. The fall alone must have killed the majority. 2 men were rescued alive, and were subsequently found to have sustained no severe injuries. The remaining 7 lost their lives.
It was the end of the 1922 expedition, a terrible tragedy, and one which Mallory took particularly to heart. He blamed himself for the deaths of the porters, though no one else blamed him. And when a 3rd expedition was planned for the pre-monsoon season of 1924, he considered long and painfully whether he should go. In the notes for one of his lectures, he discussed the motives that took men to the highest mountains.
I suppose we go to Mount Everest, granted the opportunity, because, in a word, we can't help it. Or, to state the matter rather differently, because we are mountaineers. Our case is not unlike that of one who has, for instance, a gift for music. There may be inconvenience and even damage to be sustained in devoting time to music. But the greatest danger is not devoting enough. The music is this man's adventure. To refuse the adventure is to run the risk of drying up like a pea in its shell. Mountaineers, then, take opportunities to climb mountains because they offer adventure necessary to them.
So Mallory decided to go for the 3rd time. But just before setting off, he wrote to a friend,
This is going to be more like war than mountaineering. I don't expect to come back.
Mallory was the climbing leader, and he had a formidable team that included Howard Somerville again, Noel Odell, a geologist, and Andrew Irvine, an Oxford student, who everyone called Sandy. The weather on the mountain was bad. Driving storms, heavy snowfalls, the temperature down to minus 30 degrees centigrade at night. 2 porters died of frostbite. Even so, they managed to set up a camp, Camp 6, at 26,800 feet. This was higher than anyone had ever been. Now they were in a position to discover what the final defences of the mountain were like, the North Ridge and the steep slopes of the summit pyramid. 2 men who came to know the terrain only too well describe it. First, Dr. Raymond Green.
Now, when you're climbing on Everest, it's rather like climbing on a steep roof. The tiles, as it were, are all the wrong way round. It's impossible to have any decent belays to tie yourself with a rope onto a spike of rock. There aren't any spikes of rock. There are only these sloping tiles. And when once these tiles are covered with thick snow, the task becomes impossibly dangerous. At that altitude, snow doesn't melt under your foot and form a nice firm stand. It just tinkles off down the mountainside, and if you aren't jolly careful, you tinkle off with it.
And now one of the great men of the Everest story, Eric Shipton, who died in early 1977.
The whole of that upper 1,500 feet is a great deal steeper than we'd imagined, and all the rock strata is dipping steeply to the north, which doesn't provide any foothold at all. It's all right when it's clear of snow, but otherwise it's really beastly ground to be on. Rather like the Teton Matten face of the Matterhorn, which is dead easy if you're in good conditions, but when you get bad conditions, it's hopeless.
On June the 4th, 2 men set off without oxygen for the summit, Howard Somerville and the expedition's leader, Colonel Norton.
They kept well below the crest of the North Ridge, creeping slowly upwards. Somerville was suffering from a sore throat and painful bouts of coughing, and this became so bad that he had to stop at 28,000 feet. Norton went on alone to the foot of the final pyramid of Mount Everest. He was weary, and the ground was highly dangerous. He moved slowly, with infinite effort and care. He gained an altitude of 28,126 feet, less than 900 feet from the summit. But he could go no further. It was all he could do to struggle safely down to his companion. He had taken off his goggles, thinking them unnecessary because there was little snow about, but the light was more powerfully glaring than he thought. For the next 3 days, he suffered the agonies of snow blindness.
Four days later, George Mallory and Sandy Irvine set off on the second summit bid. They carried oxygen cylinders. There had been a lot of argument about using oxygen. Some scientists said that men would die up there without it. Some mountaineers thought that it was unfair to the mountain to use it. Others, that the advantages of having it would probably be outweighed by the effort involved in carrying masks and heavy gas cylinders. Mallory had been against oxygen. Now he was to try it.
Things looked hopeful. There was still no sign of the monsoon weather. Colonel Norton had nearly reached the summit without oxygen. How much better were the chances of Mallory and Irvine with oxygen? Mallory was by far the most experienced climber on the mountain. Irvine was young, only 21, but strong and keen. Both men were fit. They planned to leave the top camp well before dawn and follow the crest of the North Ridge. For most of its length it looked straightforward. There were only 2 obstacles on it: steep rocky sections that they called the first and second steps that might have to be circumvented.
The geologist, Noel Odell, was the man in support. He slept the night at Camp 5 and on the morning of June the 8th set off alone for Camp 6. More than 50 years later, a professor at Cambridge, he remembered that morning.
And there at Camp 6, which had been vacated by George Mallory and Sandy Irvine that morning as they went off to make their attempt on the summit. And the tent was in rather state of disorder. Neither of them were particularly, what shall I say, particularly tidy people, perhaps particularly George Mallory, but most of the things that were left scattered about the floor were in connection with the oxygen apparatus. And it rather looked to me as if Sandy Irvine, who was functioning as oxygen officer to me, really, I was the principal oxygen officer, but he was my very efficient assistant and an excellent mechanic. It looked as if he'd had some trouble with the 2 sets of oxygen apparatus that they had with them, and had set off. And I went off from Camp 6 to follow them up, and the weather very soon turned worse. It hadn't been very good during that day at all, and I saw them during a clearing in the mist, high up on the ridge, approaching what to begin with I thought was the feature we called the second step. But I was uncertain about that because of the clouds that were massed around my view, and it was only during a relatively few minutes that I could make certain that they were still progressing upwards. But I might say in this connection that I came to the conclusion later that it was the first step on the ridge, which is an easier feature, we know from later climbers, an easier feature to climb. It was probably on the first step that I saw Mallory and Irvine still making their way up, but I never saw them again.
The bodies were never found. 9 years later, one ice axe was found just below the first step. It proved nothing. It is possible, just possible, but highly unlikely, that one of them reached the summit. It seems most likely, judging from where they were when Odell saw them, that they turned back before they reached the summit pyramid and fell to their deaths during their return along the ridge. There had now been 3 expeditions to Everest. 12 men had died.
For many years after this, the Dalai Lama refused to allow any further attempt. He finally relented in 1933, and another expedition was organized. They took oxygen, but were determined to try first without it. A few weeks before he died, Eric Shipton recalled the bad weather that hounded them, his climbing companion was Frank Smythe, all the way up to Camp 6.
Then the next day there was another blizzard, so we had to stay the night at second night at 27,400 feet. And by that time, I must say, I was feeling pretty weak. We set off, and I climbed about another 400 or 500 feet above the camp, I suppose, just up to about, I reckon it was about 28,000. And I then, like Somerville, sat down and let Smythe go on a bit. In fact, I returned to the camp. Little disappointed, of course, but without oxygen, one doesn't have very much emotion at all. In fact, a very good illustration, I think, of how little emotion one has and how the altitude affects one's brain. I came down that night. Smythe wanted to spend another night up there because he was And it was a very, very congested little tent, this. So I thought I'd get out from under his feet, and I went down. And just as I got to the foot of the yellow band, I was hit by a terrific blizzard, which I just couldn't stand up against. And he was, just had to cower down with my back to the wind and on all fours. I don't know how long it went on, about 20 minutes or so. And then it stopped. But I was in thick cloud, and I'd completely lost all sense of direction. And it was absolutely vital that I went in the right direction. I'd hit off the northeast spur, otherwise I'd just wandered over the north face. And I just hadn't a clue which way to go. And so I just sat down. Well, it was getting late in the evening, and it was absolutely vital, of course, that I got down to Camp 5, where the O'Burney was waiting in support. Otherwise, one would have just been frozen to death. But I couldn't have cared less. It wasn't any particular stoicism, it was just the fact that my mind was just completely numb. Well, of course, actually, in fact, there was a clearing in the mist, and I got my bearing and got on down. But it is a good illustration, I think, of how one's judgment is impaired, one's ambition is impaired, and also one's sense of fear or anything like that.
Smythe didn't get much higher than Shipton. He struggled on along the route that Norton had taken 9 years before, found he was wading, swimming almost in deep snow, and turned back at about the point where Norton had turned back. The monsoon arrived soon after, and the expedition retreated.
Throughout the 1930s, the weather was against them. There were 3 more expeditions to the Everest area, all on the northern side, and each time the monsoon came early and drove them off. The last of these attempts, in 1938, was the last attempt by the British to conquer Everest from the north.
It had been a terrible story. 17 years of repeated effort, of great expense, of much struggle and suffering, and many deaths. Men had flown over Everest by now, but still no one had stood on its summit.
Now there was a long pause. For many years the British were preoccupied with the Second World War and its aftermath. Then the route through Tibet was sealed off when the Chinese communists annexed the country. But as that happened, a new way became possible, the way through Nepal.
The mountain kingdom of Nepal, which commands the southern and western approaches to Everest, was relaxing its ancient ban on foreign visitors. In 1950, a French expedition went to central Nepal and climbed Annapurna, the first great Himalayan giant to be conquered. The next year, a British reconnaissance expedition went to Everest, this time in the post-monsoon season, this time approaching the mountain from the south. Its leader was Eric Shipton.
In 1951, I was in China, and I just got back about middle of June, and I found there were stirrings again, and in fact they'd got permission to explore the southern side, and I was invited to lead, and I decided only on a very small party because it was only reconnaissance, and I doubted very much if there was a route. In fact, discussing it with Norton, he said that it was at least 40 to 1 against our finding a route up that West Coombe. And absolutely at the last moment, I don't know if you know this story about, I got a telegram the day before I left for India asking if 2 New Zealanders could join the expedition. And the obvious answer was no, because we had very little money and It was fairly soon after the war, and organisation was quite difficult. But I'd had a New Zealander with me, Dan Grant, on that 35 expedition. He was a grand chap, and in a silly way one thinks, I thought all New Zealanders must be the same. So just in memory of him, I said yes instead of no. I immediately regretted it when I got to India and found the complications of commission and money, and we didn't even know their names. And I felt sort of clocked because although my party were much too polite to argue about it, they said, yes, but who are they? I don't know. Well, what are their names? I don't know. Where are they? I don't know. And I felt a complete idiot. And anyway, we set off rather an unusual route up the Arun gorge, up to Everest, in the middle of the monsoon, which took us a very long time. And the two New Zealanders caught us up on the way, and one was, of course, Ed Hillary. And I think it's pretty certain that if it hadn't been for that totally illogical decision, Ed would probably never seen Everest. And it was actually with him that I first saw into the upper part of the West Coombe. And it was very exciting to see that there was a route.
The Western Coombe was the great valley that Mallory had seen and named in 1921. Shipton, too, had seen it long before, but from a long way off. Now, on closer inspection, it was clear that there was a possible route there.
The hardest part would be the first part, the massive icefall that tumbles from the Coombe for 2,000 vertical feet. If a glacier is a river of ice, which it is, moving slowly downhill, then an icefall is a waterfall of ice, a maze of cliffs and deep crevasses, frozen and apparently motionless, but in fact on the move downhill in sudden, dangerous collapses. A route through here would never be safe, but it could be made.
And above the icefall lay the wide basin of the Western Coombe, then slopes of snow and ice, where it looked as if the snow would be firmer than on the northern side, and then a final, manageable ridge to the summit, the South Ridge. After 30 years of endeavour, it seemed as if the problem of Everest might be solved at last. In 1952, the Swiss sent 2 expeditions to Everest, one before the monsoon, one after. They tried the route that Shipton had found, and they very nearly reached the summit. 2 men, Raymond Lambert and Sherpa Tenzing, gained the summit ridge and were less than 800 feet from the top when exhaustion forced them to turn back.
This introduced a new element. Until now, Everest had always seemed a British problem. Now a non-British team had come close to snatching the triumph. Suddenly, the conquest of Everest was more than a matter of mountaineering concern. National pride was involved as well.
It gave a new urgency to the planning of the Himalayan Committee in London. They had to ensure that everything possible was done to guarantee success this time. To that end, they made a decision that mountaineers have argued about ever since.
The leadership had been offered, as everyone expected, to Eric Shipton, and he'd accepted it. Then the committee withdrew the offer and gave the leadership instead to an army officer, Colonel John Hunt. Long afterwards, Shipton recalled the incident, without resentment.
I specifically asked the committee to reconsider whether I should lead the party, but then they asked me to do so. But then I think my well-known views on large expeditions became an issue. Everest had become such a sort of international thing then, it was decided that they should send a large sort of military-type expedition, and I'm not much good at that sort of thing, and so it was decided to hand over to John Hunt.
Eric Shipton was an explorer. He loved hard travelling, finding a way in new and difficult country. He relished the freedom and the adventure of it. He did not like big, complicated expeditions and had no patience for the detailed planning they demanded. And he had no time for the nationalistic motive in mountaineering.
John Hunt offered the qualities that Shipton lacked. He was efficient and meticulous, dedicated to the job and trained in leadership. He chose his team with great care.
It was to me absolutely essential that everybody whom I asked to take part as climbers, as members of the climbing team, should personally want to get to the top, have this burning ambition and sort of excelsior spirit in himself, but at the same time to have the ability to sublimate some of that by the knowledge that not everyone was going to arrive at the top at all, and maybe only one or at the most two would do so. And so it was somehow this combination that I was anxious to achieve, which wasn't easy, because it had to be done basically on interview, and then by meeting as often as we could, involving people in the very complicated planning, and getting to know each other, so that if necessary, I might have the distasteful job of eliminating people who didn't, in the course of the run-up, quite make the grade.
The expedition doctor, Michael Ward, was the man who'd done more perhaps than anyone else to revive interest in Everest after the war. There were 11 climbers, mostly British, but there were 2 New Zealanders as well, Edmund Hillary and George Lowe, and there was Tenzing, the Sherpa.
For many years, expeditions had depended on the help of the Sherpas, small, sturdy men who live in the high valleys west of Everest. Because they live all their lives at 12 to 14,000 feet, they adapt easily to great altitudes. They'd been used chiefly to carry loads to the high camps, but over the years some of them became skillful mountaineers. Among these, Tenzing was outstanding.
He'd been climbing on Everest since 1935. He'd climbed the east peak of Nanda Devi. He knew the route on Everest better than anyone else. Only the year before, he'd climbed it twice with the Swiss, once almost to the top.
It was the best-equipped expedition that had ever gone to the mountain. They had aluminium alloy ladders for bridging wide crevasses, and rope ladders for the vertical ice walls. They had radio sets to keep contact between the camps. They took 2 kinds of oxygen equipment. They even had a 2-inch mortar to lob shells and bring down snow that looked as if it might avalanche.
They made an early start. Hunt was insistent that they should acclimatize gradually and thoroughly. On the 10th of March 1953, they set off on the 2-week approach march from Kathmandu to Tang Boche, 12,000 feet above sea level and within sight of Everest. They stayed 4 weeks at Tang Boche, learning to use the oxygen sets and letting their bodies get used to the more rarefied air. They did a series of training climbs up to 20,000 feet.
In mid-April, Ed Hillary went ahead with a strong party to make a route through the icefall, and a week later they were into the western Coombe. The weather was generally good, the organization worked smoothly, and a string of camps was set up and stocked. This kind of climb is like a broad-based pyramid. It takes a vast amount of support in men and materials, scaled upwards in fairly even steps and carefully planned so that nothing vital is ever missing when it's needed. All this to put 2 men on the top with the gear they need to survive.
By May the 26th, the top camp at the South Col was stocked, and they were ready to go for the summit. The first to try were 2 Britons, Charles Evans and Tom Bodillon. But on that day the weather was bad, lots of cloud and wind and fresh snow, and one of them had difficulty getting his oxygen supply working properly. Even so, they gained the south summit, the highest point ever reached by man on foot, and only 300 vertical feet from the final summit.
Here, some rapid calculations showed that if they went on for the summit, they would run out of oxygen long before they got back to the top camp. It was too risky. They turned back down again.
John Hunt decided that the second summit pair would have a much better chance if they could start from an even higher camp. On the 27th of May, the weather was too bad for anyone to venture out. The temperature that night was minus 25 degrees centigrade. But the next day, conditions were better, and 5 men carried heavy loads, some 50 pounds apiece, to a height of 27,900 feet. The gear was dumped there on a steep ridge, and 3 of them returned to the South Pole. Ed Hillary and Tenzing were left.
The ground was so steep that they had a terrible time pitching the tiny tent, and then had to lie on 2 little terraces. They anchored the tent with oxygen cylinders, and hoped that that and their own weight would hold it down. They drank a lot of tea and ate a tin of peaches and a tin of sardines. They each got about 4 hours' sleep, with oxygen to help.
Tenzing kept his boots on overnight, which made it harder to sleep, but meant that they'd be warm in the morning. Hillary took his off, and they were frozen solid in the morning. He tried softening the leather over the stove, but in the end he had to put them on still frozen. It was May the 29th, 1953.
It was really quite a good morning. There was a little bit of wind around, but generally it was clear, and we had an excellent view from our camp. And we started off together with what I knew were limited supplies of oxygen. And I would have said that throughout the rest of the day, there were very few moments that I wasn't doing mental arithmetic. We had no direct indication on our oxygen equipment, really, as to just how much oxygen you just couldn't read off, that you had enough oxygen left for 6 or 7 or 8 hours. It was all a matter of working out from the actual remaining pressure how many litres of oxygen you had left, and at the rate of consumption you were using, just how long that was going to last you, which is really quite a complicated bit of mental arithmetic. And all during the day I was constantly examining the pressure and then working out just how many hours we had left. And then we came to the long slope that goes up to the south summit. Now this long slope was quite steep, and we found that there was a great deal of deep, soft snow on it. So much so that in many places you'd struggle, almost wade a couple of feet forward, and then you could slide back through your steps and lose more ground than you'd actually made in the previous 2 steps. And this was very frustrating. Down below us now, we were really looking down the tremendous east face of Mount Everest, perhaps the greatest face on the mountain, and it still hasn't been climbed. It's an absolutely colossal ice face. And, of course, each time you slid back down through your steps, I think it was impossible not to wonder just what had happened if you couldn't stop yourself sliding.
Both men, of course, were wearing crampons, the framework of steel spikes strapped underneath the boots to bite into the ice or the hard snow. They reached the south summit, the point where Evans and Bodillon had turned back 3 days before.
Well, I looked along the ridge, and as a mountaineer who spent a lot of time climbing snow and ice ridges, I was very pleased to see that the ridge ahead looked very much like dozens or maybe hundreds of alpine ridges that I had climbed before, of course many thousands of feet lower. And in fact, the actual technical obstacles didn't really look tremendous. The fact that the ridge was corniced and overhanging on the right-hand side over the east face automatically meant that we would have to keep down off the crest of the ridge. But even here it seemed to me that there was a reasonable route where the snow on the snow slope on the left-hand side joined onto the top of the rocks. It was almost exhilarating climbing at this stage, something that quite surprised me at that sort of altitude. But things were going well, and I think we had quite an air of confidence. Well, we carried on along the ridge, and it seemed to go on for rather a long time, until we slowly approached the rock step, which we knew, or felt anyway, was going to be a major challenge at this altitude. As we approached it, I realized that the actual rock on the left certainly to me looked very steep indeed, and I had distinct doubts as to whether we would have the energy and perhaps even the skill to climb it at that altitude. But I noticed that on the right-hand side, on the eastern side, there was a great sort of pile of ice, really, just clinging rather tenuously to the rock. And it had come away a little bit from the rock, so that between the rock and the ice there was a gap, and a gap just large enough to take the human body. So I decided that this would be the way to climb it, and Tenzing agreed. So on a tight rope from Tenzing, I crawled inside this gap with my face towards the rock and my back to the ice behind. I was a little bit concerned about the ice because it really was part of the cornice, and there was always the possibility that it might break off and go tumbling down the eastern face. And I suppose there was quite a good chance, if this had happened, that I'd have gone down with it. However, I kicked my crampon feet into the ice behind and got quite a good purchase on it, and then grabbing every hold I could on the rock in front, I sort of wriggled and jammed and squirmed my way up the crack, which I think was about 40 feet high, and finally, to my great relief, pulled myself out onto a little ledge at the top. And I can remember lying there, and really for the first time, I think, in the whole climb, I became convinced that we were going to reach the summit.
Now they were on easier ground, though they still had to be careful with every step they took.
And we went round one bump, and there was still a bump ahead, and on we went, until finally we came round one bump, and there was another bump ahead of us, but beyond that, I could see a ridge dropping away towards Tibet. And that moment I realized we were very close to the top of the mountain. I looked up to the right, and above us was really more or less a snow bump, and it was only a matter of cutting steps up this, still moving quite carefully because I didn't really know whether the summit of Everest was just going to be on top of a big overhanging cornice or not. But as we got closer and closer to it, I realized that it wasn't corniced, it was a rounded summit, and then it was just a matter of those last few whacks with the ice axe, cutting the last few steps, and then we moved up onto the top of the mountain. I think my first reaction wasn't perhaps what a lot of people would think. There was no sort of ecstatic sort of feeling at all as far as I was concerned. There was certainly a deep and quiet satisfaction, but I also, I know, had a feeling of almost surprise. It was really surprised that, well, here was old Ed Hillary on top of Everest, you know. It was almost hard to believe. The fact that so many people had tried before, and some very good people had been too, and that finally here there was me, actually standing on top of the mountain. I can remember this feeling of slight astonishment, actually. I sort of shook Tenzing's hand in very formal sort of fashion, but this wasn't enough for Tenzing. He really was very excited at our success, perhaps more so than I was at this stage. And he threw his arms around my shoulder and thumped me on the back. I threw my arms around his shoulder and thumped him on the back. And we really had quite a thumping session at that stage, and it really was quite a good moment. Tenzing wanted to leave a few little things on the summit, and he made a hole in the snow, and he left some sweets, I think it was, and a little bit of chocolate. Things that were really, he regarded as a gift to the gods, who used to spend a little bit of time on top of Mount Everest.
For their companions at various camps down the mountain, it was a time for anxious waiting. None was more anxious than John Hunt. He'd supported the first summit attempt, carrying gear to 27,500 feet, and then helped Bourdillon and Evans, who were both exhausted, safely down to the western combe.
Well, we had waited all through that day. It was extremely anxious, of course. We didn't know what had happened. And by the night, we didn't know. We knew the assault was being made. We didn't know if they'd succeeded. And I'd tried to arrange a signalling process by which Wilfred Noyce, who was up on the South Col, would lay out some sleeping bags in a certain fashion at the edge of the Col, so that we could look up and see this T for top, or otherwise. And a cloud came right across the Col that evening, when in fact he was making that signal, and we never saw it. So it wasn't till the next morning that we first saw some people coming down from the South Col, and coming down this great steep ice face called the Lhotse face. We counted them, and we realized that everyone who should be coming down was coming down, so there'd been no tragedy. And we went on waiting. I suppose it must have been 3 or 4 hours while they gradually made their way down. It wasn't until they'd reached the level surface of the combe and came in towards Advanced Base Camp that we were able to communicate with them. And I went forward with a few others to try and break the strain and gather the news, good or bad. And the appearances were, looking at this party, that it was bad news. They were looking absolutely dejected. Their heads were down. They were trudging along, and obviously very exhausted. But they showed no signs of having achieved anything, and my heart sank, and I thought, my goodness. There is, of course, the possibility of a third assault, and perhaps myself having a go at that. But this wasn't really a likely chance. And then quite suddenly, when we were about, I suppose, 20 yards apart, they dramatically changed their attitude, their posture. And there was Ed Hillary pointing with his ice axe dramatically to the top of the mountain. There was George Lowe with his thumbs up. George Lowe was supporting them. And beams of joy all over their faces. And you can imagine the emotional effect on myself and those of us who were coming. I actually managed to get into some kind of a run, a trot, despite my own exhaustion, to rush forward, and the next moment I found myself reposing in the arms of Ed Hillary. I must admit I was weeping copiously, and then embracing Tenzing in the same way. It was a supreme moment.
Hillary's reaction to the triumph had been altogether more down to earth.
I think probably that my attitude to the mountain was, yes, certainly perhaps more light-hearted than John Hunt's attitude was. John, after all, did have the responsibility of the whole expedition. He was, I think, tremendously aware of the importance of success. He wanted it to be successful, and he wanted a British expedition to climb it. I think as far as I was concerned, I was enthusiastic about our expedition climbing it. But I wouldn't have said that there was any nationalistic spirit whatsoever as far as I was concerned. We reached the South Col, we were tired, we were relieved. There was my old friend George Lowe, and I used the same language to him that I would have done in the New Zealand Alps. I said, well, George, we knocked the bastard off.
Everest had been conquered. It had taken 30 years and 11 expeditions, and the deaths of 15 men. But now 2 men had stood on the summit. It was a further triumph for John Hunt that no one was killed or seriously harmed on his expedition.
When the climber first confronts a mountain, his aim is to get to the top by the safest, easiest route. When that's done, he looks for new and harder ways. In the years after 1953, dozens of mountaineers of various nationalities reached the summit of Everest. By the end of 1975, there were 4 separate routes.
In 1956, the Swiss put 2 parties on the summit by the original South Ridge route. In 1963, the Americans had 3 groups on the summit. 2 parties went up the original route. The other one climbed up the West Ridge, traversed the summit, and came down by the South Ridge, a remarkable achievement. In 1965, 9 Indian climbers reached the top by the original route. In 1970, the Japanese did it. In 1973, the Italians.
Over the years, the Chinese communists made several claims that their mountaineers had climbed the mountain by the North Ridge, the route that had defeated all the pre-war British parties. The claims were doubted. The Chinese could produce no definitive photographs, and it was thought their experience of high mountaineering was too recent to make their story credible.
With the 3 ridges climbed or claimed, attention turned to the great faces between the ridges, particularly the southwest face, which sweeps up from the western combe for 7,000 feet of relentlessly steep ice and snow and rock. The Japanese tried it and failed. Then an international expedition, then a European expedition. In 1972, Chris Bonington led a British attempt. They got high, but were beaten back by the onset of the winter storms.
Bonington swore he'd never go there again, at least not in the post-monsoon period. But 3 years later, he was there again, and in the post-monsoon season. He had learnt much from the failure of 1972.
We realized in autumn 1972 that we'd gone too late in the season. We'd actually started at the beginning of the fine weather spell that you get in the post-monsoon season, which meant that by the time we got into a position to make a summit bid at our top camp, then we'd crept into the Himalayan winter, and it was bitterly cold, and you had winds of over 100 miles an hour. So we decided we'd start that much earlier, and we started actually during the monsoon, which traditionally is a bad time to climb because you get a lot of snowfall and danger of avalanches. But in actual fact, you get very settled weather, predictable weather, when you get fine mornings and snowfall every afternoon. But most important of all, it's comparatively warm, and also there's no wind at all. So that we accepted a greater avalanche risk, and were very careful accordingly, for this lack of wind and cold. And that meant that we were climbing in good conditions throughout the expedition. We also realized, though, that we still had a race on to actually get to the top of the mountain before the arrival of the winter cold and the winter winds. And so we climbed absolutely flat out. And to do this, we had a larger team than we had in autumn 1972. In fact, we probably had the strongest team in pure climbing strength that's ever been on Everest. We had 18 climbers, 10 of which were very good lead climbers, and 8 were people in support, and 60 high-altitude Sherpas. Of course, having got all these people together, the next thing was to make sure that you coordinated their movement, you used them with absolute maximum efficiency. And I suspect that I put more thought into the actual logistics, which is the way you move people and things up a mountain. I put more thought into that than I think most other expeditions have done. And I used a computer even to actually plan this movement out before setting out on the expedition.
By now, big expeditions like this were big business. First, you had to book the mountain years ahead with the Nepalese authorities. And in 1975, the booking fee was £600. But the chief costs were in travel and equipment, and wages for the army of porters and Sherpas. Bonington raised £100,000 from Barclays Bank, who hoped to recover at least some of it through selling film and TV rights, newspaper stories, and the book that would be written, and the public lectures that would be given.
As in 1953, the early start gave them a great advantage. Before the end of August, they were above the icefall. By September the 6th, they were on the southwest face. Now it was a matter of fighting away doggedly up the apparently endless slope, with the danger of avalanches and falling rocks always present. Thousands of feet of rope were fixed to the ice with metal screws and left hanging so that the Sherpas, following up with heavy loads, could clip themselves to the rope and make the climbing easier and safer.
All the previous attempts had been halted by a major obstacle near the top of the face. The rock band, a 1,000-foot cliff so steep the snow would not lie there. On September the 20th, Nick Escort and Tut Braithwaite found a way through. 3 days later, the top camp was established above the rock band, and the first summit party moved in. They were Dougal Haston, a slim, laconic Scotsman, and a burly, bearded man from Nottingham, Doug Scott. At 3 o'clock on the morning of September the 24th, they crawled out of their tent. Doug Scott describes their journey.
Well, we'd set off from the tents about 3:30 on the morning of the 24th, and I remember it was a bitterly cold morning, lots of wind blowing around. I remember thinking I wouldn't mind being back in the tent, and I'm sure I was only going on because Dougal was going on, and he no doubt was only going on because I was going on. Anyone that's made an alpine start in the mountains will know what I'm talking about. Well, the next problem was this 30-foot step, a step of rock which down at sea level in Britain would be a climb you could do in, say, 5 or 10 minutes, but up there it took me about an hour and a half to get up this piece of rock, knocking in pegs for protection. At the top of the rock I belayed, and Dougal came through and got into some desperately unconsolidated snow that was in which he was sinking right up to his thigh, up to his hips. And he waded up this stuff, sometimes angled at 60 degrees, so it almost pressed against his face. And I came behind him to push him up into the steps he was making with his hands, and sometimes put my ice axe under his boot so it would hold him. And we changed leads eventually. Dougal did about 200 feet of this stuff, absolutely exhausting. Where I took over, it eased off a bit, but it was still a real grind to get up to that South Summit col. In all, it took about 5.5 hours, and of course we burnt up quite a lot of valuable oxygen. And at the col, we wondered if we had got enough oxygen, enough strength to continue along the half-mile summit ridge to the top.
They were well behind time. They considered bivouacking there, spending a night in the open. But when they found the going ahead much easier, they pushed on. As they neared the summit, Scott had a strange experience, reminiscent of something that happened to Frank Smythe when he was climbing alone on the North Ridge in 1933. All the time that I was climbing alone, Smythe wrote, I had a strong feeling that I was accompanied by a second person. This feeling was so strong that it completely eliminated all loneliness I might otherwise have felt. It even seemed that I was tied to my companion by a rope, and that if I slipped, he would hold me. Now, more than 40 years on, Scott sensed a similar friendly presence.
Well, going along this sort of whaleback of a ridge, I distinctly remember having a confident presence, seemingly perched on my left shoulder. It was as if my mind had split in two, and part of my mind was working outside my head, and quite often the exterior mind, or the confident presence, would refer to my inner mind, like whenever I was walking too far to the right, when I was going towards these dangerous cornices, the outer mind would urge the inner mind to get me to walk further left, back on a sensible course. And then when I was stumbling through the crust on the snow, I was getting more and more exhausted. I broke my rhythm, I was stumbling and rushing, and the outer mind again suggested to the inner mind, we got me, to slow down and to take it steady, get a normal rhythm going again. Quite a few things seemed to happen, which at the time didn't seem worth a second thought. It was only a day later that I recalled all this. Well, I stopped to take my camera out to get a photograph of Dougal against the summit, and he passed me, went up the final slope, and as he did so, he got onto better snow, slowed down, and I was able to come alongside him, and we both walked up to the top together.
On the summit, they found a metal tripod with red bunting tied to it, proof that the Chinese had climbed the mountain by the North Ridge route in the spring of 1975.
It was 6 in the evening when Haston and Scott gained the summit. It was dangerously late, but they could not tear themselves away immediately. They gazed at a glorious sunset and superb views for more than 200 miles in all directions. It was over an hour later when they set off down, and only 300 feet below the summit, darkness forced them to stop and settle down to the highest bivouac in man's history.
In fact, we found the ideal place just over the cornice. We managed to find an area where we could get round the cornice, and we tunnelled into it, into the snowbank. This took maybe 2 or 3 hours, hacking away at the snow with our ice axes, pulling the snow back behind ourselves with our gloved hands, and then gradually making this cave, getting inside, and pushing more snow against the entrance to block off ourselves from the wind, which was probably gusting at about 50 miles an hour. Inside the cave, we arranged ourselves as best we could. sat half lying on top of our rucksacks, and by this time all our oxygen had finished, in fact been finished some 3 hours before. The altitude up there was 28,700 feet. We knew of other people who spent the night out on Everest, lower down than us, but they'd spent the night out without bivouac equipment, and they had survived, although most of them had gone back to have fingers and toes cut off. So what was worrying us wasn't so much total survival, but the quality of the survival. And we really did pay 100% attention to our fingers and toes throughout the night. It was impossible to sleep. Sometimes we'd slip away for 5 or 10 minutes and then jolt awake again and realise that the cold had got right into our fingers, into our hands and into the balls of our feet. We have to furiously rub out our toes and fingers. The only way to create heat up there without oxygen is to provide friction heat, because your body doesn't seem to be able to heat itself without oxygen. And this is what we did most of the night. Eventually we got very bad pains in our kidneys, I remember.
At first light they were off again, and 3 hours later they staggered groggy but safe into camp. They were so weary that it wasn't until Scott accidentally banged into the radio set that it occurred to them to send the news to Bonington at Camp 2.
I was desperately worried. And then at about 9 o'clock that morning, the voice, I can't remember whether it was Doug or Dougal's, came across on the radio and said that not only had they reached the summit of Everest, but they were perfectly all right. They'd just got very slight frostnip. And there was at that moment a sense of relief, of joy, euphoria throughout the expedition. And I know I just broke down and I cried. And I think even now, in describing it, a certain feeling, that immense feeling of happiness. And it was a really wonderful feeling, and you just felt this feeling going right the way up through the expedition from every camp.
2 days later, 2 more parties set off for the top. One of them, Peter Boardman and Sherpa Patemba, made it comfortably, though the good weather was beginning to break up. The other pair, Martin Boyson and Mick Burke, ran into trouble. Boyson's oxygen system failed, and he had to turn back. Burke went on alone.
Boardman and Patemba were on their way down again when they met Burke. He was cheerful and confident, and determined to get to the top and shoot some movie film, though the clouds were swirling round by now and the wind was rising. Soon after they parted, a blizzard was raging, what climbers call a whiteout, when the snow is so thick it's impossible to see. Boardman and Patemba had promised to wait for Burke at the south summit. This they did, watching the storm mount. At last, at 4:30, they had to leave. If they had waited longer, they too might well have died. Mick Burke was never seen again.
Everest has claimed the lives of many brave men. Most of them died not through any failure or misjudgment of their own, but through sheer misfortune, the malice of the mountain, a sudden turn in the weather, or falling rocks, or avalanching snow, or the collapse of an ice cliff. It's been reckoned that in the Himalayas, 1 in 10 of those who go above base camp is killed. It's not surprising, therefore, that the question most often put to Himalayan climbers is, why do you do it?
When someone asked George Mallory why he climbed Everest, he said, "Because it is there." Mick Burke used to joke that it would be a cleverer trick if it wasn't there. Noel Odell, the man who last saw Mallory alive, gives a more serious answer.
I like to give the answer of the great Fridtjof Nansen, the Norwegian explorer, who, when he was asked why he wanted to seek the North Pole and go on polar expeditions, he replied, "Man wants to know, and when man no longer wants to know, he will no longer be man." And I think the same applies to mountaineering in its exploratory aspects.
More modern climbers tend to see the question in more personal terms. Doug Scott, for instance, the first Englishman to step on to the summit.
I think anyone that goes to wild mountain places, particularly the Himalaya, the more he goes, the more he's going to want to return year after year. And it really is like a drug in your system. You never seem to be able to satisfy the desire to be there. I know every winter when I'm at home, all I can think of are places I've been in the mountains, cutting along steep snow arrays, blue skies, billowy clouds below, filling up the valleys. 100 places that you can remember, and you want to return. You fret and worry during the winter time. A whole lot of reasons you've got to go climbing, just to be committed to a climb, to be taking your own life in your hands, to be in charge of your own affairs, whereas in the city there's so many government agencies who shelter you. But here in the mountains you're finally taking control again. You've got to be responsible about it, or otherwise you might be dead. But for whatever reasons I might think of go climbing, I know that once I've been involved in a struggle, I've got to the crux of the climb and I've had to pull out all the stops, survive a bivouac without equipment, climb across steep rock at altitude when there doesn't seem to be any oxygen in the air. Whenever it really extended, a long way from base camp, and you've had a struggle, a real supreme struggle, then I've known afterwards that that's why I went for the climb, for the struggle.
Finally, the man who first set foot upon the highest place on earth, Sir Edmund Hillary.
Although we may say it's dangerous and uncomfortable, which it is, I think we cannot overlook the fact that a great deal of the time it's really quite good fun. You're with a bunch of companions who you enjoy and who you respect, and who may be quite entertaining. And many of the hours you spend there, you're laughing. I mean, you're joking about something that happened, and you have this sense of comradeship, which is pretty hard to get unless people are operating together, perhaps under conditions of stress and danger. And I think the danger itself adds something to the whole thing. I really do believe that being frightened, as long as you don't panic, can be quite a stimulating experience, and one you certainly remember after it's all over. And so the part of the challenge in the whole thing, I think, is being frightened, but perhaps not giving way to fear. Fear can sort of sharpen your sensibilities. I think it can make you more effective, and certainly overcoming it and carrying on and succeeding does give you a sense of achievement. There's no question about that.
The story of man and Mount Everest has been going on a long time. For the future, two things are certain. The first is that the story will have many more chapters yet. As long as there are people on this planet, the urge to adventure will find expression. And the second is that the mountaineers of the 21st century will be performing feats which we think of today as quite impossible.